We're here. We're live. That's what the red dot says. So if indeed the internet is working, which I've had a really nice track record, Deepa, with StreamYard and this working. So I think we'll be good. But give us confidence. Hop into the comments. Let us know that you are here. We'd love to know where you're joining us from in the world. And we're going to hop into this live conversation with Deepa onto how to create a more inclusive and represented world of work and beyond, which I'm delighted to do with you, Deepa. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Amazing. So Deepa Purushothaman, you and I met years ago at a cocktail party or something somewhere. I remember my boss at the time introduced us. We had an amazing conversation and we've stayed in touch, and you've done some work on the live online classroom with Simon Sinek, which I've done as well. And so you've written this book. It's coming out in a month, in March. And so I figured, why not have you on to talk about your experiences and your work. The book is The First, the Few, the Only, which we can see over your, I believe, left shoulder. Yeah. How's it going? Tell us what's up, and let's hop into our conversation here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's going great. We are exactly a month out tomorrow, and so we're in that countdown timeline mode, but it's also really exciting. This has been a multi-year process, as it is for most authors. And I interviewed over 500 women of color in writing this book. And so although it's a book that I write and tells my own story, I mean, my excitement around it is like telling other people's stories and telling these stories that we don't hear and see often. And so for that reason alone, I'm really excited, because we need to see and hear more stories if we're going to change anything, and also have more women of color believe they belong and they can rise. And so really excited to have it out in the world for that reason.
Amazing. I mean, I'm someone who fully admits that I knew less around how to create a more equal and just world, how to use work to actually lift people up. I would be someone who was sort of guilty of saying, well, I'm not racist. I don't see color. I treat people the same. However, I've learned as I've cared about this work and tried to take myself on in this work, that if you're someone who says, I don't see color, I regret to inform you that you're part of the issue, because we operate in systems that very much do see color, whether on purpose or not. And so that's just something that I've been exploring. And so sort of the thing that I'm interested in, as this person who intends to and wishes to be an ally, how can we do that? How can we create a more just and equal world for women of color, to be able to succeed and thrive?
Yeah, no, Stephen, it's interesting. Like I wrote this for women of color, right? I was very conscious in how I wrote it, the title, who I spoke with, how I thought we were going to market it. And what's really interesting is it's allies that are showing up that really want to learn. It's white male leaders who are reaching out. I'm doing a lot of speaking, and it's actually to companies, and it's their ally groups. It's not necessarily women of color. And I have some thoughts on why. I mean, I'm getting those as well, but I wasn't sure it would land for others. Like I wasn't sure there was that interest in that, wanting to really know what it was like. And so it's really actually exciting and important, because part of what I believe and I talk about in the book is we can't change workplaces on our own, right? We didn't design them. We didn't create them. We weren't there when they were created, and we can't fix them on our own. And it's everyone's responsibility. But I really appreciate, and I think I call them co-conspirators more than allies, because I think allies have a tendency to be a little bit more bystanderish. But we need more co-conspirators if we're going to change the workplace. And so I love that. I also have to say, I start the book with this chapter on delusions, and the 10 delusions that really, underpin what I think, is related to inclusion in the workplace. And one of my delusions is that, like, I've been around a lot of leaders who I think said, like, I don't see color, like, that's not a problem for me. And the challenge with that is, I appreciate that, you don't see yourself as racist, or that other people don't see themselves as racist. But the challenge is the workplace does operate differently for me, even if it's not the people, the structure, the policies, the processes, they all operate differently. And, before we jumped on, I said to you, like, if I had just one sentence about the book, for me, it's corporate America is not a meritocracy. And we're now finally being able to talk about that. And I think that's what shifted the most in the last few years. And that's why I think what you're saying, that progression of, I really want to understand that and unpack that, is different, because we've never, even women of color were not allowed to talk about that before. Even if we believed it, there was shame and pain in actually talking about that widely. So I think that is the shift that's happening. And as a result, there is this open conversation about, so tell me how it's different. Because I maybe believe that, but we haven't heard enough stories about how it's different, right? Like exactly what that feels like and what happens.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's a nice progression. I think more and more people are realizing, oh, that's just, the sort of previous conversation of, oh, just the system. That's not me. Well, I regret to inform you, you operate within
You
that
are,
system.
exactly.
So
Yes,
we actually have to change it and shift it.
absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, this might be rudimentary for me, or I'm learning. I'm more novice in this conversation, but I'm curious. What are the typical things that you've seen and heard from your own experience, from speaking and interviewing 500, women of color in the workplace? What are some of the key issues that you've seen and that we have to combat and shift?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I wrote this out last night because I feel like that's the number one question I'm getting over and over again. Like, tell me like the things that are different for women of color in a nutshell. And so I have to be honest, like that's the entire book. It's 10 chapters on these themes that are different. So I'm not going to be able to do it justice in like 5 answers. And I ended up with about 12, and I'm not going to go through all 12. I'll just pick 3. And if you want to talk about more, we can.
Sure.
But like one example is that the workplace does show up differently for us. And so one example, and I start the book with this story, this conversation I had with Renee Myers, and she's the VP of inclusion at Netflix, and she's a good friend. And we were just chatting about the book early on. And I said, I want to understand for you, like, why is the workplace different for women of color? And I thought we would end up talking about inclusion. And what we ended up talking about was airplane design. And I love this. And I start the book with this story because it's so relevant. And she basically said, Deepa, think about getting on an airplane. And she said, I'm a mom. So I get on the plane and I have to put my luggage up. And I think about like the whole idea that it's not designed properly as a mom. Like, I don't want the luggage falling on my child. And she's tall. I'm 5'1". So then I jumped in and I was telling her, and this is why the conversation was so exciting. I have such anxiety 20 minutes before getting on an airplane. And I used to fly. I was an executive. Like I did 3 cities a week was normal for me. The 20 minutes before I got on the airplane was really stressful because I'm 5'1". And I had to, hoist the luggage into the overhead compartment. And that was a process usually because the suitcase was heavy and I'm short. And
You're
the
like
white man
scouting
sitting,
to see like who might be able to help me.
who might be able to help me. And
Yeah.
I never want to ask, right? So I'm trying, and usually someone does show up and offer assistance. But it's interesting because the white man next to me who's 5'10" or taller doesn't have that same sort of anxiety. But then also take Renee Myers, who's a Black woman. She has a very different experience than I do, right? And part of our conversation was women weren't involved in airplane design initially, right? If you actually look at the original statistics of what happened when, these compartments were designed decades ago, we weren't in the conversation. And so as a result, our input wasn't there. We might have put it under our feet, or we might have done something different, so that there was a different process. But who wants to not feel like they belong in the first 20 minutes of getting onto an airplane? So much longer story, but I share that to say like how a very simple sort of situation, you've probably never thought about the anxiety that I might face as a short woman about to get on an airplane and not having, upper body strength to hoist that, right? Like it is a process and a conversation. So it's a good example of how the workplace is similar. It shows up differently for all of us. So that's like one example of just to really get concrete. But the other is code switch.
I will say, Deepa, I've seen and experienced the anxiety in action, but I haven't experienced that 20 minutes leading up.
Yeah.
Which
and then the relief after you sit down in the seat, right?
Until then you have to take it down at the end of the flight.
Yes, exactly.
Or God forbid something is in your luggage that you need. Okay,
exactly.
Cool.
And usually people are more friendly, by the way, because they want you to get off the plane. So they're more willing to help you get it down than they are to put it up.
Either friendly or hastily, but
Yes, exactly. More in a hurry. But again, I just love this story because I think for people who don't understand that meritocracy, concept, like it's a good way of outside of work thinking about it. But I was going to say the biggest thing that I have found is that women of color code switch. So this idea that we adapt how we speak, we adapt how we think, we adapt how we act in spaces because there's a definition of what leadership or success or what is allowed as a norm in a workplace. And so women of color go through a lot to kind of edit themselves, right? And there's a lot in the book that talks about how we erase parts of ourselves. And the analogy, again, in that situation that I give often is think about if you've ever gone overseas and done a meeting in a different language or like worked for a week in a different language. That week because I used to work all the time in Latin America and so do meetings in Spanish, and that's not my native tongue, was really exhausting. By the end of the day, I was exhausted on a whole different level because I'm having to do a translation in my head. That same sort of thing happens for women of color. Do I want to share this? Do I not want to share this? Is that something I want to kind of edit? That's probably the biggest thing that I have seen show up for women of color and what makes it different. Others are just the racism and stereotypes that women of color have to go through. And they literally are there and they're not ours. We don't even know that they exist. And so to have to kind of operate around them. So, I mean, the common stereotypical things that we hear about are really true in the 500 women of color I met. So the Black women having to navigate around being seen as angry, right? Or being seen as too ambitious. The Asian women across the board having to really fight the model minority, concept, or really having to fight for, like, I have leadership qualities. I'm not just a single contributor. And the Latino women I spoke with having to really adjust or spend a lot of energy on their voice intonations or being seen as too feisty. And although those are stereotypical, I found that over and over again in the women that I spoke with. And so those are some of the things. The other is I was really surprised that I thought, that most women of color would find at some point that they would be themselves a little bit more, that they would open up, that they would, find a way that worked for them. And most of the women of color, and I skewed a little bit more senior in my interviews, what I found is they believe once they got to the seat of power, then they'd be themselves, right? This idea of once I get there, then I can show up. And it was actually, in fact, the opposite. There's a paradox that happens because once you're in a seat of power, there's more expectation around conforming and belonging. And so this real pressure of, so when do I really get to be myself? And so that's what I found with the first, the few, the only. These are women who were the first in their family to go to college, or one of the only in a department, one of the few in a company. They were always navigating the sense of how do I show up and what is okay and what does success look like? And it doesn't look like me. So what does that say about me, whether that's conscious or not? So those are just a few examples, but there's many.
Yeah. And I've heard even sort of this notion of, well, the conversation at the executive table is the score of the football game. So you better learn football so that you can enter and participate in that conversation, which again, I'm hearing is a bit of code switching and having to be a chameleon to fit in, which shouldn't be right. I mean, I think we should create teams in which each other's interests are, we're curious about what our backgrounds and we're curious about our interests and that we allow each other to shine.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious your thoughts.
Yeah, no. I've talked quite a bit in my career. So I spent 21 years, 2 decades in corporate. That conversation about football, right? That's a great move outside of the race conversation. And I think that's a real conundrum. And what I found though, for women of color, it's even more complicated. So I think with the football analogy, there's a little bit of a divergence. Some women believe so that you learn the football so you can be part of the conversation. I never did. I never wanted to engage in something that didn't work for me. And so frankly, I just didn't do that. Most women do, because I do think it's easy to kind of, jump in that sort of way. So I don't have an opinion on it, but I just didn't want to. That never was enjoyable to me. And so I didn't want to be in that situation. But I think for women of color, it's even more complicated because it's not just the football. There's a real deep sense of belonging that ties to all of these concepts. There's a lot more outside pressure or outside message and how we grew up that we don't belong, that we're not seen on television, that we don't see leaders that look like us. Our teachers didn't look like us. Our coaches didn't look like us. So with that sense of really not belonging or not being in the football conversation runs so much deeper that I think it just shows up in a slightly different way. And there's a real discussion that happens. So do I need to learn the football? Do I need to adjust? Do I not? That the women of color that I met are really struggling with in a very different way. Like it's a much more philosophical, deep conversation around the choice to conform or not, right? Or the consciousness, or maybe not choice, because I'm not saying you get to do it every single time, but the agency you have around those choices on a daily basis feels very heavy to a lot of the women of color right now.
Yeah. I just want to say hi to Mary from Chicago. We have a LinkedIn user from South Lake Tahoe. Just know that we can only see LinkedIn users. If you'd like to let us know who you are, you're welcome to. Kristen, hello from Philadelphia, and would like to hear more about the 10 delusions, which you can go more into if you wish, Deepa. And please keep any questions or comments coming here. Again, this might be the same LinkedIn user from South Lake Tahoe. I've had to learn baseball and American football not only to be able to participate in the office conversations, but also to understand the consulting slang, which consists of a lot of sports references. Wow. Which is both, education, but it shouldn't necessarily have to be that way. And I
Absolutely.
think part of inclusion and representation is to find analogies that work not just for some, but work for many.
Yeah, or just have more, right? Like I'm not saying we have to get rid of the football conversation or baseball conversation altogether, but can we have some balance of other topics that might relate more, so that there's a little bit more variety in the pressure that I think we feel to have to learn that.
Oh, good. And good. It's Alexandra, my friend. Wonderful to see you here. One of the things I was speaking to you before we went on, a new friend of mine is Mita Malik, who I know you've traded a
Yes.
lot of emails with, but have yet to connect. I follow her, and she's doing wonderful work around representation of women in the workforce. My LinkedIn algorithm has rewarded me that, like, every morning when I open up my LinkedIn, like, her post is at the top.
Yes.
I just love
She's
everything she does.
prolific. Yes.
She's
Yes.
fantastic. And so she's shown me a lot of magazines and a lot of, whenever we see a fetus, for an example, in a medical journal, for
Correct.
some reason that fetus always has white skin. And
Correct.
so now we're beginning to see fetuses with dark skin, because indeed fetuses can have dark skin as well.
Right.
So I love following Mita's work because she's highlighting and showing for me how there is representation, or at least there's a lot more work to go, but she's pointing out to me how there is, which is just more of what we need.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you want to speak more to the 10 delusions? We can also speak about power. We had a bit of a conversation there, but yeah.
Yeah, no. So, the delusions were, I just wanted to kind of level set before we jumped into the experience of women of color, what that looked like. So I'll just pick a couple, because again, going through 10 would take the whole hour. But I start with the first one that I talk about is this idea of the pipeline, right? A lot of people and a lot of companies will just say they can't find women of color. And so what I lay out is that how that statement really is silly in a lot of ways. And it really comes down to not looking in the right places, and the fact that the data shows that we tend to have networks and know people that look like us. And as a result, recruiters and, HR leaders who are sitting in those seats tend to have, even on LinkedIn, if you look, like, you tend to have people that look like you or do the same business as you. And as a result, that idea that the pipeline is broken is actually flawed. So it's a delusion. And I talk about how and where you can find diverse talent. You just need to think about it differently. Another delusion that I talk about is this idea of one seat. And, Stephen, you said you looked at the TED Talk that we did last week. And so this is one of the big concepts, this idea that there is a seat for a woman or a woman of color at a C-suite, right? So there's one seat. So we're fighting with each other for that one seat. Or there's even a designation that there's only one seat. Like, who decided there was one seat, right? Why can't it be all the seats or half the seats or 4 of the seats? And so that idea of scarcity makes us in a situation where we believe there is one seat. And secondly, that we're competing for it. So that's like another one that I talk about. I mentioned, one of the delusions I talked about is that I don't see race and the challenges in that. Another one, which we've also just kind of touched on before, is this idea that once you get to the top, you'll have more ability to kind of, be your own or do your own. And that doesn't really work that way. Another one.
In fact, you said there's often more pressure to conform.
More pressure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then simple things like the idea that inclusion or a program is going to fix everything. And you started this, that it's not a programmatic, like, yes, there are structures and systems and things we need to fix, but there's also people. And so it's a 2-part process. And, finally, just to pick up on the last one, is this idea that we can do this hard work without really having hard conversations. And that, inclusion is put a woman in a seat, especially a woman of color, and she'll fix everything. And that is just a very flawed way of thinking we're going to make change. So it really goes through some of the challenges and honestly some of the ways I think we're really approaching inclusion in 2022, and really, really trying to think about how can we do it differently and why some of that thinking is flawed.
Yeah. For me, I love seeing when organizations have people on their DEI and B teams who aren't just underrepresented women or people of color. When people are raising their hands and stepping into those roles, even though they look like me rather than look like you, to me, that's progress.
Yeah.
So I love seeing, DE&I and B teams that that are actually diverse, that are living what they're attempting to bring to life.
I think we need everything, right? And I think part of the challenge right now is a lot of those seats are seen as places where women of color can flourish or naturally, to your point, lead. And yes, I want that, but we want to lead in engineering. We want to lead in technology. We want to lead in other spaces. And so, yeah, the idea that that's like the place that we should be leading. Some of us want to lead there, and I think that's great, but many of us want to lead in other places. And so there should be that thought as well.
Yeah, fantastic. My friend Tara comments here, and just building on Alexandra's points, that sports analogies are the worst. It seems to be the easiest analogy for a team, but can be super lazy. It's also a bad analogy because in sports there are winners and losers, and in career and business there's no winners or losers. There's a head and behind, which is work that my colleague Simon Sinek wrote about in The Infinite
Yes.
Game. So sports analogies shouldn't really belong in games that are infinite. So there you go. Let's use better analogies, because there's no winner and loser. So you have the word power in the subtitle, redefining power. This live is really around how women of color can find and own their power through their careers and beyond. I think, so I have a definition of power that I operate with, that a friend of mine, Tiziana Casciaro, who wrote the book Power for All.
Yes.
And she and her co-author Julie define power as having possession over desired resources, which in some respects can be hard, because it sort of just says, well, power is power and deal with it, which can be disempowering to many who don't have it. I know they've written this book around how power is accessible for all, but I'd love to learn more about how you use and define the word power in your body of work, in your work, to see sort of what progress we can make there.
Yeah, no, and I love that you pointed out that book, because Julie and I chatted as they were still writing it, just because we were connected at Harvard. And so I got to see an early copy of it, and I actually refer to it in my last chapter. Nice. So my last chapter is really about new power. So maybe we start there and we can go backwards. And it's this idea that traditional definitions of power, I, by the way, don't think they work for most women, many people, but they especially don't work for women of color. Again, with that airplane analogy, that they weren't defined by us and they really don't work for us. And when I read a lot of like what the books on power, right, the Machiavellis, the Prince, all the things, the 48 rules, like the books that are seen as powerful, the gospel on power. And I met with all these women, like they didn't seem to resonate. They didn't seem to really fit. And it also matched this conversation that I was having with women of color who got to the top and were really questioning if it was worth it. Like, is this really satisfying? And one of the things that I found in speaking with all these women is I think we want more. Yes, we want the rise, but we also want to contribute and make change. And so power in that way, or impact and leadership, is really different for many of the women of color I've met with. For me, power is being able to look at everything you've been taught and to really choose for yourself what works for you. So it's not like an easy, like, here's what power is. I have a chapter and I call them shedding and caring, that we need to shed all these messages that we have been told and taught, and that we need to really do work to really carry forward messages that work for us. And I think for women of color, that's really important, because we get so many subconscious and, indirect and direct messages that we aren't leaders, that we don't belong, that we're not sitting in seats of power, that we're not even seen as powerful. And if you don't take the work and do the work to actually rewrite those narratives, you end up with this very skewed idea of what power is. You end up finding it, or maybe sitting in that seat and getting to it and not really realizing it doesn't work for you. I also think the last couple of years have shown us, with COVID and everything else, that we're not going to solve the world's problems with traditional definitions of power. So I don't necessarily give one definition, although I in the last chapter give you 4 ideas to think about for women of color. But what I'm suggesting is we need a new manifesto, because the one that we've been given has kind of gotten us where we've gotten. It doesn't really work. And it is about power over people, right? Versus power for all of us, and power in a very different way. And so I focus on the power of me and the power of we, like that we need to figure out what is power for us as women of color. And that's really the most important thing. But in that same sort of discussion, we also need to find community, because for a lot of women of color, this navigating corporate spaces especially is very isolating, is very confusing, is very crazy making. And so finding your sisters and realizing what is yours to take and what is the system is also a process that you need to have. And eventually this leads you to a conversation where you can decide traditional definitions of power weren't really defined by us, don't really work for us. And so we get to decide what power is, what success is. And most of the women that I spoke with, and myself included, have chosen different new definitions. It's not the definitions that we were taught. Like I was taught as a good Indian, daughter to like go find safety and stability and go find like a really great job with a great title. And that was going to be success. I got all those things and I was still not happy. And a lot of the women of color I interviewed, like the most shocking thing of everything that I did was that most of the women of color I met were sick. With some sort of undiagnosed illness, right? So not like a cancer diagnosis or something that was clear cut. Most of these women had like really indescribable symptoms. So stomach ache, headache, skin rashes, heart palpitations, fertility issues, things that they'd seen many, many doctors for, and they were undiagnosed. And it has, I think it comes from, and in all the discussions, from really chasing something that doesn't really fit for us or doesn't really match us, doesn't really see us, or doesn't really want us to be successful. And yet we're taught that's what we should want. And so for me, to kind of get to your answer,
Yeah.
power is about liberation. Power is about deciding you don't need to take on what you've been told, and that you get to write for yourself what works for you. And my definition might be different, but I think the traditional top down, really aggressive, assertive, white male definition of power that we've all kind of been taught to aspire to, and that is the standard, doesn't really, that's not what I want. I don't know why I thought I wanted that for a long time, but it's not. I've had that. Don't need that. Don't want that. Doesn't really fulfill me.
Yeah.
And so it's time to really rewrite what that looks like.
Yeah. This is the book that both Deepa and I are referencing, Power for All. So Tiziana Casciaro and Julie Battaliana, who's at Harvard as well, are the co-authors of that. But what I love about this is I'm making a connection, Deepa, between the way you're speaking about power, which is very empowering, and the definition that Tiziana and Julie use, which is having power over desire, or having possession over desired resources. Correct. Which means for us to look internal to us, and say, what do I want to be known for? What do I have that I find value in? And then how do I find people that value what I have? Which I think we all deserve.
Yeah. No, absolutely. There's also, as you're saying that, one of the stories I love, and again, I could have written an entire book just talking about definitions of power, and I had to work really hard not to. But there's a story I love in the book, because I talked to Stacey Brown Philpott, and so she was the CEO of TaskRabbit, a Black woman, really trailblazing, sits on many boards in the tech space. And one of the things she told me was, her daughter was doing a project for school a couple of years ago and was supposed to kind of come up with role models that really inspire her. And Stacey thought she was going to talk about Michelle Obama or Jennifer Lopez or somebody, in the popular culture that had impact. And instead, her daughter said, "No, Mom, you do, because you actually care for me, and you listen to me, and you do the small things." And so Stacey and I had this really big conversation about what leadership is, and power is maybe not power over, right? It's not those big seats, but it's actually making people around you feel comfortable. I know Simon and others call it psychological safety, but it's kind of really what if that's leadership? What if leadership is that sense of belonging, and that sense of this person actually allows me to be who I am, and really kind of, create space for that. And that's what good leadership, and that's what power is. And that's who we want to be around. So just to give you a flavor of the kinds of conversations I have.
Yeah. And there's a difference between having authority over, and people following you because they want to, which I think, the definition of leadership that you and I believe in is more of that latter of, everyone. I'm a big believer that leaders are purveyors in attention, right? It's not necessarily time, because we can make someone feel mattered and seen without a huge amount of time. So it's about, I think everyone matters, and people respond to when they feel as though they do matter through the behavior of leaders. So wonderful. Keep the comments coming in, and if you have any questions for Deepa on her work, please keep them coming as well. Deepa, something that I'm curious in, so I love that it is co-conspirators, as you say it, as opposed to allies, because allies makes me think of World War II. I love that change of phrase. So, people read the book and they take in the message. What's the change that you wish to see? I mean, vision for you that in 5, 10, 50, however many years, because your work and your book exists, what's changing? What's different in our world because of your work?
I think for women of color, it's more clarity around when to stay and go in situations. It's more clarity around agency. It's really feeling allowed. I mean, a lot of the book is about permission. We have never given ourselves permission to question everything around us. We've been taught, the basis for a lot of this are the messages we get in childhood. And a lot of women of color are taught not to rock the boat, or that they're going to have to work harder than others to get, a fair share, or that, attention is a bad thing, that, if you just work hard and keep your head down, everything will show up. And there were a lot of women that were taught those things. And so what I'm hoping to show is that you have permission to really do that differently. You have permission to show up in your full self. Not every situation and every company will allow for it, but maybe then it's time for you to go find one that will, but that you have choice, that you have permission to ask different questions, to push on things. I think for allies and for other co-conspirators, I really want them to lean into changing the system. There's also a line that I talk about. I interviewed this really amazing lobbyist and lawyer, and she talks about how when a king dies, in olden days, king dies, like you make the statement, the king is dead, long live the king, right? Because there will be a new king or queen put right in their place, right? That it's not the person, it's kind of the role that kind of carries that. In the same sort of way, like we can make active choice on how that changes, right? We can make active choice on what power looks like and what leadership looks like, what success looks like, how we do American business. I mean, a lot of what I'm questioning are the underpinnings of capitalism, right? And just kind of really what do we even value in 2022 as we're coming out of this pandemic and having different conversations on how work doesn't work for most of us, and what is even important to us as a society, as a planet. So I'm hoping it gives allies some of that language and some of that ability to see that we can question the system. I also hope immediately it allows them to really intervene in moments. So, I talk about when a woman of color is speaking in a meeting, what traditionally happens and how you can actually support her voice in coming through. Or, what we're finding a lot on Zoom is people thought it would actually create more equity, right? Because everyone's on Zoom and they're not in person vying for attention. It's actually created more disconnect for women of color and being able to be seen in sponsorship and those kinds of things. So it's really about understanding today what you need to do to intervene, but also longer term, how do we make change so that, work really works for most people, because it doesn't right now. We saw that with all the moms leaving. We're seeing that with all the women exiting the workforce, and especially women of color are high in those numbers.
Yeah. Do you have any understanding or reasons as to why you said through the pandemic and going on Zoom, there was a thought that it'd create more equity and it hasn't? Like what's behind that?
Because I think people thought, well, you're not in person, right? So there'll be less bias that happens, right? Because I also shared in the beginning that we tend to prefer people, or we tend to defer to people who look like us. So people thought it's more of an equalizer. You're on Zoom. But what happens is the same handful of voices get time, right? If you don't actually make space for people who don't jump in or are a little bit more quiet, or for whatever reason don't feel like they have permission to really take up space, it actually doesn't allow for that. You have to be much more conscious in those processes to actually make space. Yeah. So a lot of this is, again, women of color have not been taught that they're allowed to take up space. They're not been taught that they can ask for more. I'm not saying everybody, but it's kind of the majority of the women of color I've talked to have had to really do deep work to kind of find their voice and to really figure that out. If they didn't come from families where that was supported and, shared. Some Black women did, but I did not find that in any of the other women that I spoke with. So it's really about that space. And so that's what's happening on Zoom.
Yeah. And I've seen this is sort of early, the first sort of 6 months of pandemic. I saw a stat that our communications with strong ties went up some 25%, and our communication with weak ties went down, which meant it further, creates that bias if we just speak to who we speak to, which
absolutely
makes it worse. My good friend Tara asks a question here. How do you recommend we start to unlearn those messages we've been taught? What would be the first step for us to be able to tap into our true desires? Love it.
Yes, Tara. Yes. And so, Tara, it's not a quick thing. I wish it was, and I could just say, do these 3 things. But I think the first is just paying more attention. So what I have found is most women of color, and this happened for myself. So my backstory is I moved across the country at that point, 16 years into my career, had just gotten married, was on the most intense project of my life, and started to get sick. And so for me, it ended up being like a really serious illness. I took a leave of absence for almost 8 months. That made me question, like, how do I want to work? And what is the space that work takes up in my life? Partly because the universe intervened and said I had to, right? And I found that with a lot of the women that I spoke with. So usually a life event happens, right? Something happens that's very unfair, whether it's like a divorce or something at home, or you didn't get a promotion, or some sort of racist or discriminatory, event happens at work. And it kind of stops you in your tracks. And so you start to pay attention to, what was I taught? What do I believe? You start to write messages. I tell women to pay attention because there's usually about a dozen messages that all of us, this is not just for women of color, but things that we were taught in childhood that kind of are played on repeat for us. Like you're not enough, you don't deserve that, or you should be quiet. And if you start to pay attention in those really difficult situations, what's coming up for you, you can start to rewrite those messages. But it's kind of doing work like that, like literally journaling, paying attention, going deep into yourself about like what serves me that I believe about myself and what is not serving me anymore. And working with practitioners or working with people or just kind of getting quiet. It's about getting quiet because you kind of know, but we don't always pay attention to ourselves, or we don't make space for that voice to come out. And so it's doing that sort of inner work and really paying attention more.
Yeah. And Deepa, can that sort of shattering moment also come from just something that happens in the world that you observe or see, whether it's personal or not? I mean, like I know for so many, unfortunately, the death of George Floyd wasn't in vain because we saw it. We saw it live. And we saw that injustice. So can part of that sort of wake up not necessarily be a personal tragedy, but something that we see out there in the world?
I think that's what we're seeing. So absolutely. I think it's, we're in a moment also, and I talk a lot, I use the word, we're in a moment quite a bit because I feel like we're in this moment where we've had between COVID and, challenges around work, George Floyd's murder. We just had a nexus of a number of issues that has made us question, where are we and like what's possible, and the environmental issues that we have, some groups like to talk about and others like to ignore that seem like they're actually much more alive, and there's more data showing up during this COVID time, right? That around what has happened as people have more stayed at home and haven't really, driven cars in the same rates, and what's happened to pollution and things like that. So yes, I think we're in a moment where we're more conscious and more willing to make change. But I think all I'm saying, Stephen, is like something has to happen to prompt us to want to change, because otherwise we've all been I again use the word indoctrinated. We've all been indoctrinated to believe success and chase more and money and fame and title and security are what is important. And it's either some sort of event or some sort of life event that makes us question or shocks us into asking new questions about what we want for ourselves.
Yeah, we cannot outsource transformation.
Correct. Yes.
That has to come from within.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think one sort of other just observation here, and we're going to begin to wind down. So if you have any other comments or questions for Deepa, please put them in now. I mean, I'm also seeing, I think we've all seen a shift in power in just employment and this great resignation and the great talent shuffle. I think now more than ever, there's more power in the employee to make choice. And I think we're seeing more and more people making choice based on flexibility and culture, and people who are willing to take a decrease in pay to still be paid fairly, but to do something at an organization where they are treated better and can have choice around when and where they work, that it isn't just the 9 to 5 days a week just because. So I'm seeing that shift in power, which I think is healthy. So any other sort of comments or thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, we're in this moment where we're seeing people walk with their feet, right? In a way, like I think this has been a growing conversation. We used to label it the millennial conversation, right? There was more purpose around work, and I think what has just shifted is that people are actually making the choice versus just talking about it. They're actually leaving the workforce. We're also finding women of color, in particular, and Black women, at the highest rates creating their own businesses, right? So that's another way. Like if the culture doesn't work for me, and I'm not going to go try another culture because they all kind of do this, I'm going to create my own company and really change the paradigm. That's what I'm seeing the most, and that's really what feels different and exciting. Again, I wrote a book on women of color, but what I'm really talking about is the paradigm doesn't work for us, any of us, right? The model was created with a two-parent sort of, model where one parent stayed at home, usually the woman, and the other went out and, made money in an outside job. That was the model that corporate America is built on. It's never been adjusted or accommodated, kind of the change that's come. And as a result, that's what we're really talking about. Is it's not, I mean, again, if I talk to my white male friends, it's not working for you all either, right? Like no one wants to work 20 hours a day and not see their children. That model is antiquated, but how do we really recreate it? How do we talk about it differently? And all I'm suggesting is that maybe women of color can help really center or drive that conversation, because we have been so marginalized for so long, because we haven't had space to really have our views heard, and because so often we are the ones that are most discriminated against in these spaces. So if we could find a way to really talk about what doesn't work for us, if we could make it work for us, probably would start to work better for everybody. That's really what my goal is and what I'm talking about.
Beautiful. Love that. There's one question here from Kristen. We can't all go work somewhere else. How do we begin to advocate for these changes regardless of our level? Sounds like choosing to be the leader that you wish you had, even if you don't have that position. What thoughts do
Absolutely.
you
I mean,
have
I think that's what's so fascinating is a lot of people believe that, change and inclusion only happens at the C level. And although I think that's so important and has to happen if you're really going to have true change, like you can't really make change if you don't have buy-in at the C level. Like I do believe that. But if you just have the C level believing it, and you don't have inclusion and don't have like great work practices or culture at the other levels, it's not going to change. Like it doesn't, it's not just a top-down mandate. And what we found in the research that we've done is that actually most people feel like they are belonging or not belonging, or included or not included at the manager level. Like it's actually one level above you, and really at that center level that you can actually affect the most change. And so yes, if you can't walk away from the situation you're in, like how do you speak up when you see something that's egregious, right? So when a woman of color is speaking up and she's getting talked over, or I present an idea and 3 ideas later, Stephen gets credit for my idea. Like, what do you do in the moment? So it's kind of being more conscious and being aware. And there's exercises in the book and things that I ask us to practice. A lot of it is when like a microaggression or a racist incident happens, most of us are stunned. I mean, Stephen, you're going to be as stunned as I am if someone says something racist in a room. Like we've just been taught to, I think, be stunned. And it's practicing, like, how do you jump in when that happens? How do I jump in as a woman of color when that happens? Because it's okay to jump in. But if we don't practice how to jump in, we're not going to be able to jump in. So it's a little bit of that, is instead of believing it's not going to happen, I want us to understand the system is set up so it will. So how do you prepare for the interventions and actually, do good work in those moments when that's probably the best time to make change?
Yeah,
So
well, and I love to hear, Deepa, that a lot of the people interested in your book aren't just women of color, that they're people that look like me, because it means, we are also, because I don't think it's fair to say, well, sorry, women of color, you have to vouch for each other. That's not going to make as much progress as if there's more people who look like me, who goes, hold on a second, I think we need to pause right there, or that's not cool. So yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer that change happens either through evolution or revolution, and it can meet in the middle. But to your point, middle managers have tons of power. They have what I call multi-directional power, where they have influence up, influence side to side, and down. And so yeah, Chris, and I hope you can find at least one other person who shares in your vision and values wherever you are working, and to choose to be that change. And do it because you know it's right, and the results in time will speak for itself. And you can lead a horse to water, you can't force them to drink, but you can choose to lead the way that you want to lead, and hopefully right and better outcomes will happen for you and those around you. Awesome, Deepa. This has been a joy and a treat to have you on and talk through this and learn more. Anything else we've yet to discuss that you want to throw in there? And how can people learn more about your book, your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe I'll just kind of touch on the last point just to close us out. I mean, I do focus a lot on women of color finding their power. I do focus on, how do you know when it's okay to stay or go, right? And I think it's a fair question. Like, not everyone's going to be able to go, and I do talk about that in the book, right? A lot of us are in situations because we have to make money or we have to pay the bills, and there's other obligations. I think I just want to open the window, because a lot of women of color are told to stay, and we don't have the conversation that it's okay to leave. And I think so that's where that conversation or push comes from. But we also can't all leave. I remember early on in writing this book, my agent was like, you can't write a book where you're telling everyone to leave. And that's not what I'm doing. I'm asking us to wake up a little bit more and be clear what is not working, so we can actually move forward. So I would just say that. I would also say it's a very optimistic view of the world, right? Even though I'm talking about a lot of the negative things that are happening, I think we're in a moment where change is possible. I think we're in a moment where women of color are finding more power and using their voice and sharing what doesn't work for us. And I also think that we can rewrite a lot of this if we do work together with co-conspirators to make it so. So it is a very optimistic, positive moment. If we were ever going to do it, it's now, is the other message. So let's move through this moment that we're in because of the pandemic, because of what's happening, because of the racial conversations we're having. So I think that that's just an important message, because it's not all doom and gloom, but if we don't operate now or don't make change now, I don't know when we ever will. So that's probably what I would say about the last words there. As far as my work, you can go to my website, deepapuru.com. You can find out more about the book and about the speaking and the other things that we're doing. And we're in pre-order. So if people do pre-order the book right now, we are inviting you to a 3-part discussion. We're going to talk about things like, how do you know when to stay or go? How do you write a book as a woman of color and kind of go the traditional route? And also a session on allyship. So how do you be a better ally for women of color? So I'd love to see your listeners in that process.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I'm left with greater hope that your book exists and that your book is being welcomed and there's demand and desire for it. I see that as progress in this conversation, and the action and the momentum that we need to continue here. So the book is the first, the few, the only, coming out with Harper Business in a month tomorrow, in March 2022. Deepa also does great work with nFormation and her partner Raw Goddess there, so check that out as well. Deepa, thank you for joining us. Thank you everyone here for being here live and with such great comments and questions. Hey, Jesse, glad you're here as well. Deepa, thank you, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.